So we're going to take a look at the revival of trade in Europe and all the things that are happening here as a result of not only the Crusades, but also the new discoveries that are happening in Europe. So grab your notes and let's go. First of all, we need to take a look at some of the trade routes. All of these trade routes are leading to the Mediterranean. There were a number of different ways that you could get there, and you can see that there was a southern route that primarily was a water route. Goods from the east were coming across the Arabian Sea, up through the Red Sea to the Nile River, and eventually to the Mediterranean. This particular image right here does not show a lot of that, but it does show some. There was also a central route in which this was a route that went by land and by sea. And so all the goods coming from the east, they came through the Persian Gulf. They were carried across land from Baghdad up to Damascus, which then would come out near the Mediterranean. And then the third route, and the option we could go there, is the northern route. This is more well known as the Silk Road. This was an all-land route. This was the most commonly used, and it was the land route that connected Beijing to Constantinople. And then, of course, Constantinople would distribute the goods throughout the rest of the Mediterranean. Part of the reason why in the Diverted Crusade, the city of Venice wanted to take the Crusaders up there and ransack Constantinople. So these are the three routes. Ultimately, Italy was the one who was controlling most of the trade coming through the Mediterranean leading up to this point. They were the primary targets, and they were the ones who were helping to distribute that throughout most of Western Europe. Because of that, money and banking becomes a very important part of Italian history, as well as we see a massive change going on in Europe as a result of all of the trade that is going on. The barter system was fading away because the barter system could not meet the demands of the trade. Imagine that you wanted to buy something coming off of a ship that had just come through one of those three routes through the Mediterranean, and now you want to take your cow or your chickens and you want to go trade for some new clothes or spices that are coming off of those ships. Those ship traders are not going to want those things to take them all the way back to Asia. And so they're going to need to have some currency, and that's part of what brings all the banking system back. Many of the feudal lords produced their own coins in the earlier days. The values were variable depending upon the metal quality, and so the higher the metal quality, the more valuable the coins would be. And some people certainly would have mixed the metals to be able to make their precious metals go further. And that's where things became difficult, trying to determine how valuable a coin really was. The florin was a gold coin that was made by the city of Florence, became one of the most common coins used during this time because of its very high quality and the fact that it was not mixed with a lot of other metals. And so it became the standard by which most other coins were valued based off the florin. Again, that comes from the city of Florence in Italy. There's a group of people known as money changers that were very experienced, and they knew the knowledge and the value of coins. They also could determine counterfeit currency much better than the average person. And so they could determine a fair value from one currency to another. And so they provided a lot of services very similar to a modern bank. And these money changers became very common in most of the cities in which you would travel throughout the latter Middle Ages. Some of those services would have included, I guess I need to mention bank here. So the banca is the original term. It means bench, and this was a table of the money changer, which you would go to exchange your money. And so many of the services that were offered here for those that were visiting the banca or the money changer here would be things like exchange of coins from one currency to another. Sometimes they would provide loans to kings, loans to those who are traveling. They would even provide loans to the Pope in some cases. They also provided letters of credit. It was not very safe for you to travel in Middle Ages Europe, especially if you were traveling with a whole bunch of valuable coins. Many people were robbed. Again, go back and watch Robin Hood if you are unfamiliar with this practice. And so they started issuing things like a check, or it was called a letter of credit. So essentially, you go see the banker in your hometown, and you would turn in your money to this banker. He would issue a letter of credit that you would take with you to the next village that you were going to take your money. And so then when you arrive, you would then have this piece of paper that you would turn in, and you would get the coins, excuse me, you get the coins that you would exchange back once you get to the new village. And so this became a very much safer way to travel with money. There's a practice called usury. This is an old term we don't use very often anymore, but you can see it in the old King James Version of Scripture as well. But usury was the practice of charging interest when you borrowed money. And so this was a sin according to the church, because they took some of the verses out of context from the Old Testament, which they said that the Bible condemns charging usury. And while those verses do seem to indicate that in some cases, it's really talking about charging interest to your fellow believer. And the Catholic Church expanded that, and they said, well, you should not charge interest to anybody. And so it very soon became very acceptable for people to charge interest when you borrow money, and most people disregarded the Catholic Church's ideas on this. As we start moving into town, the townsmen started to gain more and more freedom. Every town had to have a charter, and this was issued by the feudal lord, and it granted them certain privileges and powers. It also defined who the citizens were and what their privileges were. So some people had free status. This was a person who lived in a town for 1 year and a day, so 1 day more than a year, and he was considered to be free at that point. It meant that he was able to sustain himself for a full year without having to rely on the Lord for any sort of support, any sort of financial compensation. So there were some people that were able to earn that. Those who lived in the town were exempt from the obligations of the manor. The townsmen as a group worked together to provide services to the Lord. Instead of you as an individual having to work the land for the Lord, the town itself would do those responsibilities. And therefore, there was less work involved when you were working together in the masses. Town justice was regulated most of the time by the people themselves. The townsmen were tried in a court of his own town and was judged by his peers rather than by the lord of the land. And this way, they believed that they had a more fair justice system and that they were being judged by their own neighbors rather than the Lord, who really didn't know what happened and what was going on. Many towns granted commercial privileges as well, the right to buy and sell freely in the town market. And so if you were granted that privilege, you could create whatever it is that you're good at or whatever you had learned how to do, and you could try to make a profit and sell in the town. Now, one of the ways that you were able to have those commercial privileges is by joining a merchant or craft guild. So a guild is an organization that helps to regulate the business activity of the town. Many times the guilds were also responsible for establishing schools, for caring for the poor, the widows, the orphans. It was an organizational structure, an organizational system. And so you had many times had to belong to the guild in order to participate in town activities. They wanted everybody to contribute toward the betterment of their society. If you were a merchant, you were trying to sell or create items, you often had to join a merchant guild. And this gave the merchants a monopoly of the town's trade. So it did not allow anybody else to come into the town and sell the same items if you did not belong to this guild. So for example, let's say that there was a donut guild. And so the organization would create a group of people who were all bakers, all making donuts. And if somebody came through the town and they wanted to also make donuts, they would have to join the guild before they were permitted to sell their donuts. And that's where we talk about the monopoly. Nobody else were allowed to do that. They were allowed to sell in the town. So many times the merchant guild would set prices at a certain level, and that way everybody in the guild was making a similar amount of money. There was also the craft guild that would specialize here by a particular type of trade. This was in addition to the merchant guild. And so people who were making donuts would be part of the baker's guild. They would specialize in donuts. Well, they might have somebody else that specializes in baked breads. They might have somebody else who specializes in pies. And you'd all belong to the baker's guild. You also had a butcher's guild, a shoemaker's guild, and so on. And so these craft guilds regulated the hours that its members could work. It also regulated wages that could be earned and the amount of employees that they could hire. Once again, that way each shop was working on the same level playing field, and you did not have somebody that was taking advantage of a situation and putting somebody else out of business. It also helped to guarantee the quality of the products that were being created. If you were part of the craft guild, they didn't want somebody who was going to be making subpar donuts. That place is going to put a bad mark on the craft guild. And they wanted to create a high level of quality products in there. There are three classes or three groups of people leading up to the craft guild. The first was the apprentice. And if you were an apprentice, you would generally work for anywhere between 2 years to 7 years, learning underneath a master craftsman. And he would teach you everything that he knows. Once you've worked there under the apprentice and you're ready to move on to be a journeyman, then you could go out and you could seek employment from another master, but you would now be a skilled worker where you have some experience underneath your belt. So think of the apprentice perhaps a little bit like high school. The journeyman might be a little bit more in the college realm, and then you get to the master where you have your degree and now you can go out and you can do it for yourself. So the master, in order to earn that level of master in the craft guild, you had to pass an oral examination before the guild. That meant they could ask you any question that they wanted to ask you, and you had to be able to answer. The second thing you had to do is you had to create a masterpiece, showing your talent, your ability to create, and your understanding of the guild. And then thirdly, you had to take an oath to follow the regulations of the guild without any question. So all of these steps help to create the middle class. And the middle class began emerging for the first time in European history. And most of the middle class was focused on trade. Anybody that relied upon trade to make a living that was generally part of this middle class. So merchants, bankers, craftsmen, skilled laborers. And this is part of what led to the decline of feudalism and the birth of modern society. Most of the middle class wealth was in money or goods rather than land. And this is a huge transition point from feudalism into the modern European era, where we said in feudalism, land was the major source of wealth, where now it's going to be money or it's going to be goods that you've created or traded for. So many of the middle class people here were able to grow their wealth, and they were able to purchase items or able to create clothing and homes to rival many of the feudal lords and the nobility. And there was less separation between those that were very wealthy and those that were really poor, like we saw in feudalism. Now there was this middle ground that people could look like the nobility even though they weren't truly nobility. And because of a lot of these reasons, the noble power is weakened. There's no longer this lord and king who has total power over everybody. Now they become a little bit more on a level playing field. And most towns and most people are going to begin asking for a king to rule over them instead of a lord. And so kings are going to come in, take over, and the nobility is going to have to submit to a king rule. As we look inside of a town and the life that would have existed inside of the walls of these manors, the towns were many times enclosed by walls, mostly for their protection. But as the town increased and as it grew and as the population got bigger and bigger, there was no place for the town to grow. They couldn't build homes outside the city walls because it wasn't safe. And so they had to build together. Did that, they would then have to build upward. And so many of these old European towns have very narrow streets, very crowded houses, and very tall houses, especially for this time period. Not all of them were safe, but this was the only way they were able to cram all these people together. Well, that led to very dark and filthy streets. They were extremely dirty, no way to clean them out. The stench for many of these cities could be smelled for miles away because there was no place for the waste product to go. No plumbing, no sewer system, and so all of this just ran freely throughout the streets. Poor sanitation here many times caused disease that was carried around by dogs and rats throughout the city. We're not even talking about the plague yet, although that's coming. But the town was a very exciting place. Now, notwithstanding the crowded, dark, dirty streets and the confinement and all that stuff, but it was an exciting place because this was the center of activity. The town square was where everybody got together for gatherings of excitement, of major town events, parties, all those type of things. And so it was the place to be. And merchants and traders would often come into these towns with new and exciting things that had come from Asia and things that people had never seen before. And they'd bring them to the town square and everybody would gather together and they would see all of the new things that were happening.